So the purpose of this research is to identify sex differences in imaging and neurobehavioral outcomes following repetitive head impacts in amateur soccer players. So concussion and mild traumatic brain injury is a well-known occurrence in athletes. In addition, soccer players have a unique form of repetitive head impacts in the form of heading that previously have been associated with worse cognitive outcomes, and also findings on MRI imaging looking at white matter microstructure. Additionally, there is a lot of thought that women may suffer worse outcomes following concussion and repetitive head injury than men. However, there's a lot of pressure that suggests that women may be more likely to endure symptoms than men, and men may be more likely to minimize or conceal symptoms. Neuroimaging offers a potential way of objectively characterizing injury burden and looking at the relationship between exposure to repetitive head impacts and outcomes. But this has not yet been harnessed to look at sex differences. So the purpose of this research was to use imaging to look at the difference in the response between men and women to repetitive head impacts. So we looked at imaging and outcomes following repetitive traumatic brain injury in soccer players. In terms, so we're looking at both the brain and also cognitive performance. The imaging metric that we used is a metric of white matter injury on diffusion tensor imaging called fractional anisotropy, which is thought to index white matter injury. What we wanted to discover was whether or not sex modified the relationship between repetitive head impacts and both imaging outcomes and neurobehavioral outcomes. So we did a kind of analysis that allowed us to compare men and women to the degree that they responded in terms of the white matter microstructural injury and also cognitive performance on a working memory task. So what we found is that across both imaging and cognitive outcomes, that women tended to respond to a greater degree than men. So across the brain, we found both areas of high and low FA, where the degree of the response or the relationship between FA and the number of headers that the players reported each year was greater for women than for men. We found the same pattern across both heading and also a lifetime history of concussion and in a working memory task. So one of the goals of the overall study, of which this is one component, is to identify thresholds for safe heading exposure. And I think that this research points to the fact that those thresholds will probably need to be sex-specific, and that further investigation should look at sex as a modifier of the relationship between repetitive head impacts and outcomes.
And just to clarify that, I think that when we think about thresholds, what we mean is that by preventing someone from hitting their head against the ball too many times, we can minimize the chance that they're going to have an adverse effect, that they're going to injure their brain. By setting a limit where, for example, we keep track of how many times someone heads that soccer ball and not letting them exceed a certain limit based on these thresholds that we've defined, that can potentially protect that person. So really what we're saying, I think, is that to protect women, they're likely going to need to keep to a lower limit of heading in order to not have an excess burden of adverse outcomes and long-term problems. So one thing I would say is that, so in asking the question, what would this mean for patients, it's important to step back and think about the context of this study, which does not examine patients. Everyone in this study is a young, healthy, active amateur soccer player. They're going to school, going to work. They don't think they have problems. And what we're identifying is that due to the amount of repetitive impact to their head, they actually do have at least a subclinical, if not an overt clinical problem that they don't recognize. So I think that the bigger question is not really what does this mean for patients, but what does this mean for the public at large in trying to prevent those people from becoming brain injury patients. And this really has very wide ramifications. We're looking at soccer, and Ava is identifying how women may be particularly sensitive, but this is a much bigger problem, and this defines, for example, how women in other contexts, perhaps in combat, for example, need to be actually treated differently in order to protect them equally. So we're really getting at the basic notion of how much low-level repetitive impact to the head is tolerated by individuals, and as we've seen, that's different depending on whether you're a man or a woman.